Okay. Okay, so thank you everyone for joining us again for session 2 of Marxism 101. This session we're going to concentrate on imperialism as a concept, as imperialism as a whole period of history of capitalism, and also the particular book by Lenin, Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism. This book was written in 1916, which was when the First World War was still raging, and it was published in 1917 first. And in fact, it's such a clear and concise picture of the development of capitalism into the stage of imperialism that it could hardly be bettered. And any kind of presentation about imperialism, you can't really do much better than to actually just use Lenin's book and the titles of his chapters as the outline of the features of imperialism that we want to talk about. So this presentation will mostly focus on what's in Lenin's book. I strongly urge everyone to actually read it. It's not very long. It's concise but very meaty, packed full of very clear, definite description of the nature of capitalism in the modern world. So of course, some things have happened since 1916. Some things have changed, but the general trend was really correctly identified in that book. And although some things have happened differently from what we might have expected, each passing decade has really only confirmed the accuracy of Lenin's analysis of capitalism in that book. So last week we talked about the labor theory of value and surplus value and where profit comes from, and how capitalists make a profit selling commodities at their real value in the marketplace. And we talked about the tendency of the rate of profit to fall because of the competition driving the capitalist to innovate. So each individual capitalist being driven to find more productive and efficient ways of producing to try to gain a momentary advantage over their competitors. But even at the time when Marx was writing Das Kapital, for example, it was already clear that competition, although it's the rule of capitalism, inevitably gives rise to monopoly. That is, the actual working out of the competitive process means that the weaker competitors die and the larger ones survive. The concentration of ownership increases, and ultimately the result will be that a handful of larger and larger corporations will control the production and marketing in any given sector of the economy. So the rise of monopoly is not an accident. It inevitably arises out of the actual working out of capitalist competition. It can't be made to go away. It can be moderated or in some ways directed by state, by government policies, but it cannot be just wished away. So all the schemes to solve the world's problem with small is beautiful and with sort of images of small-scale local business resuming its sway over the economy are simply just fantasies. Because even if somebody could magically, wave a magic wand, make the monopolies disappear and restore purely competitive capitalism, the same processes of competition would immediately start giving rise to the same, weeding out of the weaker competitors, the same increasing inequality of ownership, and eventually monopolies would arise again. So what this means is that in every sector, a handful of large-scale corporations dominate each sector of the economy, which means that they're in a position to collaborate with each other, as opposed to having thousands and tens of thousands of small scale producers who are pretty much at the mercy of the market forces of supply and demand. You have a handful of corporations who are able to collaborate with each other, divide up markets, engage in price fixing and the division of markets and division of the control of inputs and assets. Another factor is that you get vertical integration, which is that corporations will not just attempt to control the market that they produce for. They'll also attempt to control their sources of inputs and raw materials. So they have a vested interest in owning not just the factories that produce one particular commodity, but the factories that produce the machines that supply those factories, and the mines and forests that produce the raw materials for that factory, and the railroads and the shipping companies that transport the materials and so on. So you get more larger scale corporations which are not restricted to just one form of economic activity. They'll be branching out and engulfing more and more of the economy, having started from the position of being in factory that produced one commodity. As the truly successful ones that grow larger will also diversify. So there's this concentration of production, and the rise of monopolies is integral to it actually is embedded in the competitive process of capitalism, and it can't be avoided. So the second feature of this stage of capitalism is the rise of banks as a power in the economy. Banks originally were relatively modest middlemen who fulfilled the role of bringing together small concentrations of money and combining them, putting them at the disposal of capitalists to actually turn money into capital. But the period when banks simply fulfilled a kind of bookkeeping service to capital is long gone. The banks have also undergone this process of growing larger and developing a monopoly position. And as their role expands, they become more powerful. They become actors in the economy with, that their intentions and their policies can have a real impact on the direction of economic development. And further, that through the process of interlocking directorships of banks and other monopoly corporations, and other kinds of ways in which large corporations can interact and collude, banks have become completely integral into the running of the corporations. It's no longer really a separate sector. So we have the rise of what's called finance capital, where it's no longer just banking capital, but capital which is really integrated with the whole all the economic processes of production and distribution and marketing and so on. And what this means is that, as well, that banks can have a real influence on, for example, with the development of mining. This is something that we see with Canadian banks. The Canadian banking system is not the largest in the world, but it actually has some of the largest banks in the world, because the Canadian banking system is characterized by, the fewest but largest banks within a whole national banking system of many countries in the world. So the decisions that the banks make about whether or not they will in fact fund economic activity can have a real impact on where in the world mining companies are developing resources, for example, and the conditions under which mining development takes place. As we know right now, there are actual political campaigns going on to try to pressure the banks into withholding capital from fossil fuel developments. So it's openly acknowledged by everyone that the decisions of banks will have an impact on the nature of economic activity in the whole society. This also applies to insurance companies, where banking and insurance have become more and more integrated as well. And so there's also a campaign going on to try to convince major insurance companies to withdraw insurance from pipeline projects as a way of stopping the construction of undesirable pipelines. So another aspect of modern monopoly capitalism is the export of capital as opposed to the export of commodities. In the earlier part of the 19th century, say, the domination of British imperialism really was based on the fact that they could export manufactured goods everywhere in the world. And the flood of cheap, efficiently manufactured goods would simply swamp the local traditional production of goods in those countries. So they came to dominate the world through the export of commodities. But in the modern world, it is far more important that capitalists can export capital. This is particularly the case as the economies of the main imperial powers essentially become saturated. As their economies develop, all the productive capacity has already been developed. Everything that's profitable to do has already been done. There's really not, fewer and fewer places for capital to be invested in a highly developed economy. So it's absolutely essential for them to find other places to go, other places to invest their capital. So this again is not an optional policy that capitalism could either be international or it could be just national in scope. There really is no option. Even if the capitalists as a class and their governments had a policy of economic nationalism or isolationism, that they wanted only to invest in their own country, it just wouldn't work. They've run out of places to invest, and the logic of in capitalist investment is going to force them into international investment, and which brings with it all the not just the economic but the political developments of how the more advanced and wealthier countries attempt to control and influence other countries in the world. So what this means is that in the period just in the second half of the 19th century, it was a period of actual conquest, where the dominant capitalist powers actually sent out armies and conquered other parts of the world and developed, created colonies with their direct rule and control of those colonies to control their capital and those markets. This is no longer the case. Through the effects of two world wars and the rise of socialism and the socialist camp after the Second World War, and the need to mitigate capitalist competition because of the threat, the danger, and the example of socialism. This created an opening for the colonies to succeed in anti-imperialist struggles, to be able to win formal independence. But before this process of the formal independence of colonies was even complete, the process of neocolonialism had already started. That is, where they substitute various forms of economic dominance and coercion through trade and aid and various other processes. So instead of direct rule by the imperial powers, you now have the indirect rule of capital could dictate terms to the weaker and poorer or less developed countries. The highest stage of that is that we now have these global trade treaties which explicitly dictate the freedom of movement of capital, that the countries that are coerced into signing these agreements are not allowed to put any barriers in place of the free movement of capital. They are where corporations explicitly have been given the right to sue governments for any kinds of policies that might impinge upon their future profits. So that even the capacity of governments to have, say, environmental protection or health and safety considerations are impeded and overthrown by corporations being able to sue to prevent governments from, or to demand compensation if governments do anything like that, which happens to impinge upon their profits. There's a horribly egregious case, one of the Latin American countries, where one of the corporations was advertising baby formula, and the rate of child mortality went up because social conditions were such that it was difficult for people to get, they couldn't ensure clean water with which to mix up this baby powder, and it was causing illness and death amongst infants. So the government attempted a public health campaign to tell people that that's not a good idea. That breastfeeding was better than baby formula for the health of the babies, and then the rate of child mortality went down. And the corporation sued the government because this impacted their rate of profit, because they couldn't sell as much baby formula. The government was forced to stop this public health campaign, and the rate of child mortality went up again. So there's no limit to the ruthlessness with which this indirect coercion of the neo-colonial governments will take place in the world today. So Lenin talked about the division of the world among the great powers. That is that at the time that he was writing, 1916, they were in fact in the midst of the First World War, which was the first great fruit of this, the completion of the division of the world amongst the great powers, which is that essentially once the conquest of the world was complete, it's only redivision that was possible. That is, wars between imperial powers to redivide the spoils of imperial conquest. But this is a feature which has changed somewhat in the modern world. After 2 world wars, essentially there was nothing left of economic production anywhere in the world except the United States, and in a very secondary way, Canada. This destruction of the world was so great, by the end of the Second World War, that something between 90 and 100% of the production of all really strategically important economic sectors was in the United States. It was the one economy that was unaffected, that had not suffered destruction in this war. So the domination of the US was more absolute than any other individual imperial power had ever been. And they were able to impose their dictate on other imperialist countries as well. This is the period when you had the creation of NATO and so on. But also, of course, at the same time, there was the rise of the socialist camp, that the Soviet Union had not only survived the Second World War, but now had allies amongst the new socialist countries in Eastern Europe, where socialist governments had arisen out of the chaos of the war under the protection of the Soviets. So there was this required muting of the competition between the capitalist countries. They could not afford to go directly to war with each other in order to redivide the spoils of imperial competition or of imperial conquest. So we had a long period of relative peace in the imperial center after the Second World War. Of course, this is not a period of world peace because there continued to be dreadful wars of imperialism trying to prevent the rise of independent states. There was the Korean War, the Vietnam War, and coups and in all through Latin America, and the fomenting of civil wars in Africa and so on. So it was not a period of peace and stability in the world as a whole, but it was a period that was not, where there was not overt and direct competition between the different imperial powers. You know, England, France, Germany, the US gave up the belligerence that they had traditionally displayed to each other. So very fortunately, we've now reached a stage in the world with the rise of China as an economic power, as well as a social and political one, that a similar kind of break still applies to the overt, direct competition of imperial countries between each other. They're not going to go to war with each other directly. So the danger of war in the world still is between the US-led belligerence towards any country that attempts to develop an independent economic policy, like as we've seen with Syria and Iraq and Afghanistan and Venezuela and so on and so on. And of course, there are increasing belligerence towards Russia and China. So Russia, despite the fall of socialism there, did not simply collapse and fall within the orbit of American imperialism. They managed to develop their own independent nationalist sort of set of gangsters to prey on and exploit the ruins of the socialist economy. And so the American hostility towards Russia continued almost unchecked. And it's a slightly different form of anti-Russian propaganda, but it has still continued, and of economic belligerence and military belligerence as they've expanded the boundaries of NATO and tried to move the actual military foreign bases closer and closer to the Russian borders and so on in what were formerly the socialist countries of Eastern Europe. So although there have been these mitigating factors which have damped down the tendency of imperialist countries to go to war with each other, that competition has not entirely gone away, and it has simply taken other forms. And the overwhelming dominance of US imperialism has not entirely gone away in part because of its overwhelming military dominance. American military spending is far greater than that of the next 10 biggest military spenders in the world. But the fact that there was this long period of overtly peaceful development amongst all the different developed countries has enabled other imperial countries to begin to reestablish their own potential for independent action in the world. So American imperialism no longer has complete control over capitalism in its entirety. And this, in fact, means that we're probably going to be in a rather dangerous and unstable situation over the next historical period. So, so the division of the world among the great powers is not a one-time event which happened and then it's done with. It's still going on today. There is still an ongoing struggle in a more neo-colonial form, a less directly military and less directly political, but still a very intense struggle over control of different economic regions in the world and over control of the resources of the less developed countries. So the last couple of sections of Lenin's book are titled Imperialism, a Special Stage of Capitalism. So he makes the point that imperialism is not an optional policy. It is a necessary historical development, and nor does it peacefully evolve into some kind of single world government or a post-competitive world economy. This is another one of the sort of wishful thinking kind of theories that some people have, that it is certainly true that the larger and larger corporations, more and more inequality of wealth means more and more overall socialized planning and development of the world economy. But it is still, because these larger and larger groups are still within private hands and still for the purpose of private profit, the socializing effects of this large scale cannot just simply and peacefully be turned into socialism itself. So the last section is called Parasitism and Decay of Capitalism. Now, this relates to the fact that once you get to a certain stage of monopoly, a certain level of inequality of ownership, it does in fact reduce the competition amongst capitalists, and it does reduce that engine competition, that engine of motivating new developments of technology, new developments of automation, and so on. At the same time, the greater and greater inequality of ownership and wealth means that the return of the rentier, the completely parasitical owners of large capital, who simply are what we used to call coupon clippers. There's a very interesting book by Thomas Piketty, who's a French economist. He wrote a book called Capital in the 21st Century. And it's quite a monumental book. And essentially his thesis is that capitalism was developing greater and greater inequality of ownership and wealth. And so you had this parasitical class who owned more and more, but who provided no useful services. By dint of their ownership, they simply, they were entitled to dividends and so that the productive and useful work was being more and more done by those who served them and not by the class directly itself. But this class of completely parasitical capitalists was essentially demolished by the shocks and the destruction of the First World War, the Great Depression, the Second World War. So that by the time we came out of the Second World War, this class really no longer existed. But that just through the course of the ongoing development of further competition, giving rise to further monopoly, giving rise to more and more concentration of ownership, this parasitical class has redeveloped, is in the process of redeveloping. That as long as you have rates of profit that are greater than the rate of increase of the economy as a whole, by definition, that means more and more of the wealth of society falls into the hands of the capitalists. You get more and more inequality. And this inequality is going to lead to the same result in the long term. Unless there is some really vigorous intervention by the state to change this. But the state, of course, is more and more controlled more and more within the hands of this monopoly class as well, and therefore less and less likely to carry out the sort of Keynesian economics and the social services, the social safety net, and so on, that would mitigate this effect of greater and greater inequality of wealth and ownership. So one of the factors that Lenin talked about, that we've talked about a lot, is that the leaders and the upper strata of the working class could be bought off with the super profits of imperialism, essentially bringing opportunism into the working class movement. And that even Marx talked about this in the British working class, that the wealthier countries could afford to make some concessions to their own working class to damp down the effect of class struggle, to damp down the violence and destructiveness of class struggle, so that they could continue to peacefully make more profits and more effectively make use of the kind of direct terrorism, the direct coercion could be reserved for use in the colonies, in the less developed parts of the world, where poverty was greater and social inequality created more unrest and more difficulties. But as time goes on, and the tendency of the rate of profit to fall means capital has fewer options, even within the advanced capitalist countries, within the imperial centers. So this tendency to buy off the working class within its own country is in fact weakened. And really, since the 1980s, with say Reagan in the US, Thatcher in Britain, but other leaders of that same ilk in many of the capitalist countries, we've had the rise of neoliberalism. They developed a theory that would, a sort of false theory of economics that would justify turning the clock back on many of these kinds of social services and social safety networks, and in fact attacking the income levels and the buying power of the working class, even within the imperial centers. So we have, in fact, an example of one of the most egregious examples of this right here in Alberta, with the Kenney government attacking all possible forms of social spending, except for the investment of billions of dollars directly into oil and gas corporations. They've attacked education, they've attacked healthcare. They're in the midst of trying to privatize subsidized housing, virtually everything that could mitigate the misery of the working class is under attack by this government in the interests of, like a very short-term, ideologically blinded idea of increasing profits by simply draining the working class in a more rigid and ruthless manner. So this, although many things have happened since Lenin wrote this book, the basic premise here is the same, that competition will always give rise to increased monopoly, increased inequality of ownership, until you reach the point of a sufficiently small number of sufficiently large economic entities, corporations, being able to exert control over both manipulating market forces and manipulating government policies to bring every aspect of society under their control, and every aspect of social policy will be subordinated to increasing their profits, both internally and externally in terms of foreign policy. So this is what we mean by imperialism. It's not only direct conquest of other countries which was historically the original meaning of the word, but that it's intrinsically built into the economic process, that this need to attempt to control the economy of the world as a whole, and the fact that this is a dead end. So this is one thing that Lenin did not talk about explicitly in the book. In fact, he said so in the introduction when the book was reissued later on during the Soviet era, that in order to avoid the censors, he kind of talked around the fact that the only solution to the problem of imperialism is socialism. He kind of worded it slightly differently, but it's pretty clear that in fact this is the only way out of imperialism. There's just no other potential for additional development for capitalism. This is its highest stage. It cannot go any further. I'll come back to Thomas Piketty, this French economist. He's one of those, I don't know if they're still around. Way back in the 60s, I spent a year in France, and I learned of the existence of something which we just didn't seem to have in North America, which is anti-socialist Marxists. That is, not just Marxists who claim to be, better socialists than the Communist Party was, which we're all familiar with, but people who were not socialists at all. They were opposed to socialism. They're all in favor of capitalism. They did not want the working class to become the ruling class, but they actually understood the reality of class society. They acknowledged the reality of class struggle. So this is the kind of intellectual that we didn't really have in North America, but they did have them in France, and I believe in other countries in Europe. And I think that we could say that Thomas Piketty started out as one of those. Like his book, Capital in the 21st Century, he was not making the case for socialism. He was making the case for, a really big change in policy of capitalist governments in order to rescue capitalism from itself. But since then, he himself has gone on to write some books, articles that have been collected into books, actually making a case for socialism. That because in large part, I think the climate crisis has become so dire that it's become clear, even to many people who began as apologists for capitalism, that there is no future for capitalism, that socialism has become not only the only logical possible outcome, but the only practical outcome, the only possible solution to the problems of capitalism. So I think I will stop there and just invite everybody to make their own comments, questions, remarks. And I guess we can also, I can stop the